what efforts are being made by AU to curtail the use of government funds to faith-based organizations?
Oh boy, we are really in the thick of that right now. That has been a very frustrating experience, an issue that we had hoped would change with the election of President Obama. As a candidate, President Obama talked about changing the faith-based initiative in a couple of significant ways, ending proselytism in these programs, and telling the groups to take the money that they cannot engage in religious discrimination with public funds. That's what he said he was going to do. Unfortunately, once he got into office, I think he fell in with some bad company and was persuaded to kind of change his views, so that hasn't happened. Now, ideally, in our ideal world, there wouldn't be a faith-based office. We have a problem with an office that does nothing but look for ways to funnel your tax money to religious groups. Just don't feel comfortable with that notion. And, of course, the idea of giving money to religious groups and then expecting them to stop being religious when they provide their services is a little bit strange, too. So the best thing to do would be just shut down the office. But that's not really being contemplated. So we were advocating for reforming it in a couple of other ways. Now, much of what President Obama has done, I support. One of the things he does that's great, and he's been doing this since the inauguration, which I attended down on the Mall, was he always speaks in a way that's inclusive of everybody in this country, the religious believers and the non-believers. He'll name a list of people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and then he'll say, and non-believers. And he includes everybody. That's good. I am disappointed that he did not reform the faith-based initiative as he said he would. We're continuing to work on that. Barry Lynn, who's the executive director of Americans United, serves on a White House task force looking at some of these issues under the theory that it was better to be working with the administration, trying to affect policy, rather than just standing outside throwing stones. So we are working, we're continuing to work, and I hope that we can get some change. Now, if we don't, in the administration, then we can still look at the courts under certain circumstances. We have to be careful how we pick our cases these days. Supreme Court is pretty conservative, but maybe we can look at the courts for some relief.
How much money goes to that?
See, nobody knows. That's a very good question. I've been trying to get an answer to that since the Bush years. Nobody has a hard figure. You hear $2 billion. People say $2 billion. That's very high. I think that's probably some type of cumulative social service spending that includes a lot of non-religious groups too. Once under the Bush administration put out a list of groups that were getting money under the faith-based initiative to prove that they were diverse in their approach to religious groups. And a lot of reporters parroted the figures from that list, but when you looked at it, some of the groups weren't religious. They had religious-sounding names. Like maybe they were in a town with a name like St. Joseph's. And it was St. Joseph's Soup Kitchen, so everybody assumed it was religious. But it was not, it was just a location. So very frustrating. We haven't been able to get an answer to that, even basic information like that.
I think the history on that's kind of interesting because it's always been sort of rumored, this is going way back, that money would flow to churches before elections. Money would show up for a new roof and that sort of thing. And, it's one of those things, how do you run that down? Because
right.
But now they made it up front, but I do think it's political, and I think Obama said, look, I'd like to buy part of the black community, particularly the ministers, so I'll just give them money.
There was we did do some research on that question under the Bush administration. There was a guy running the faith-based office for a while named James Tuohy. And he would appear, especially in the mid-2000s, during the midterm, the 2004 re-election of Bush, and then in 2006 during the midterms. He would appear in churches and in other venues in congressional districts where there was a tight race. And he would tell the religious community about all this money they were going to get under the faith-based initiative. Now, whether they got it or not, I don't know, but they were being led to believe that if they got the right guy in office, who of course was a Republican, the gates would be open because his opponent would want to shut that money off. So there was evidence of that. We actually did substantiate some of that. That's another one of the problems with the faith-based initiative is that it's just corrupting. You get these groups being sort of told that if they vote the right way, whether it's under a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, they'll get some tax funding, and it just leaves a bad taste in the mouth. The federal government doesn't provide a lot of services directly itself in the social service arena. It relies on second parties and third parties to do it. And the normal procedure is you put out a contract bid. You say, we want somebody to provide these services, say for homeless veterans. And we want them to have a place to live, and we want them to have 3 square meals a day. We want them to have access to X, Y, and Z. We want them to have counseling, and who's going to give us this? Well, any organization that thinks it can provide those services is free to put in a proposal and explain how they're going to do it and what they're going to charge for it. And as long as you've got a nonprofit form, as you point out, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, you understand the terms of the contract call for you're running a secular program for homeless veterans, you can't preach, you're providing services, 3 squares a day, a bed, what have you, and you provide that, and you go for it. Now, maybe a religious group will win the contract because they've got a good plan, or maybe a non-religious group will win the program. The faith-based office began operating under the assumption somehow, under the Bush administration, that religious groups always do things more effectively and cheaper than secular groups. Now, what is the empirical research that is the case? None. It does not exist. It became an article of faith, so to speak, under the Bush administration, and has kind of continued into the public consciousness. It is a religious country. Most people think pretty well of religious groups. So people naturally are thinking that they're going to do things better. But they have been tainted by the same scandals that have affected a lot of other organizations. We just asked the Catholic Church about that. They've been accused of wasting funds. They've been accused of not running effective programs. We really need to get back to what you've just mentioned, and that is looking at who's going to do this job the best, not necessarily the cheapest, but who's going to provide the services in the best way in the terms of the contract, and stop assuming that religious groups automatically are better and throwing all the money at them.
So there is really no bidding going on.
Our argument is it's a sham. That the bidding, well, in some cases, the government was putting out requests for proposals specifically stated that religious groups it was only open to religious groups. Now, we've always managed to get those yanked. I mean, that's obviously unconstitutional. Our lawyers, I feel sorry for them. They comb the Federal Register every week looking for language like that in requests for proposals. And when they find it, they write to the overseeing government agency and they have it yanked, because you just can't do that. You can't say this is only open to religious groups. The problem is, in the Bush administration, and maybe, I don't know, under Obama too, I don't know this for sure, but they put people in charge of the process who had this bias. There was a guy named David Quo who worked in the faith-based office under Bush. After leaving the office, he wrote a book about his experiences, and it was a rather negative book. He didn't really think much of the process. He'd gone in as a true believer, but he became cynical after working under the Bush administration. And one of the things he said was that the people who were put in charge of the task of examining the contract bids would just discard those that were non-religious. They had a bias toward the faith-based group, so even if the non-religious group had a solid plan and an effective way of doing it, they weren't going to get their foot in the door.
Let me give you a specific example. Right here, I live in Kansas City, Kansas, and which is, if it's not widely known, it should be, is largely dominated by the Catholic Church. Large number of Catholics in Wyandotte County and so forth. Well, Senator Brownback, senator from Kansas, former Methodist, was converted to Catholicism by Opus Dei. And lo and behold, the urban renewal program in Kansas City, Kansas, is building new houses and restored houses all around the cathedral. And so that helps, there's also other people that live there close to the cathedral. They say, oh, isn't it good that God is favoring our neighborhood? And, nothing against housing for such people. And I live just a few blocks from that. I said, isn't that just an interesting coincidence? So that's what we're talking about. It just so happens that that's the way it works.